continuing with a series for February that we're going on our third week now, working with the book Nonviolent Communication, a language of life, a language of compassion by Marshall Rosenberg. And this is our way here at Unity of Auburn of observing the season for nonviolence. The season runs from January 30th to April 4th, and it's done in honor of two people who gave their lives for the principles of nonviolence, Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. So just a quick review of a couple of the things we covered last week. First, what is nonviolent communication? Well, it's a process that we can use to facilitate clear and complete communication that fosters connection rather than separation. That's what it's all about, is connection. Learning how to engage with others, even in difficult situations where difficult things need to be said, and those situations where we tend to want to push away, it enables us to engage in compassion. That's a valuable skill. It's designed to help us to avoid four major roadblocks to that kind of effective and compassionate communication. And those roadblocks are, number one, making moralistic judgments. The second one is making comparisons. The third is denying responsibility, and the fourth is making demands instead of requests. And that leads us into the four steps of the process of nonviolent communication, which is, first of all, we started last week with step number one, which means we observe rather than evaluate. The second step is that we identify our feelings and we take responsibility for our feelings. That's what we're going to start on today. The third step is that we identify our needs in the situation. And then the final step is that we make a request of the other person rather than a demand. So we got started last time with step one, making observations instead of evaluations or offering our opinion on a subject. And we used the admittedly far-fetched example of a teen who didn't clean up their room or put their dishes away, left their stuff sitting around. I know that's a wild example, but for those of you who don't know what that might look like, there's an example. Does it look familiar to anyone? It could be me up there, but so we're going to leave that up there for a few minutes. Because here's the scenario. Mom gets home, it's 7 p.m., she's put in a long day at work, probably a double shift or something like that, and this is what greets her when she gets home. She may not be aware of it, but she's vulnerable at this point. She's vulnerable because she's tired, she's hungry, right? She's maybe a little bit stressed out. And now she has to deal with this, all right? So I think we can all appreciate how challenging it might be to remain objective, calm, and compassionate in this situation, when it would be so easy to give in to the urge to be all snarky, sarcastic, and let the anger flow and all that stuff. In fact, our surrounding culture sends us this message that it's somehow admirable to tell it like it is, which is just another way of saying the first thing that pops into your head, whether it's an insult or sarcastic or a put down. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of effort to avoid the temptation of leading off with a judgment, an opinion, an evaluation, an insult, whatever it is, at a time like this. Again, especially when you're vulnerable. I mean, how often does it start with a parent getting home, seeing this and saying something like, "You're so inconsiderate, lazy, sloppy, slovenly. This place looks like a pigsty," and on it goes. Which is guaranteed to make sure that communication never happens. Boom, it's going to stop right there. Now think about what might happen if we were to lead off with an observation. Mom could say something like, "I noticed that I can't walk across the floor without stepping on your clothes." Or, "I see that the bowl you used for popcorn last night is still on the couch over there where you were sitting." It's pretty hard to deny or argue with a simple, objective, factual observation. The evidence is right there in front of you. It lets the other person know that we want to talk about the situation, not them. It may well be about what they did or did not do, but we're not making an evaluation of their worth as a human being. Their character is not being criticized. This isn't a performance evaluation. That's a whole different thing. Maybe perfectly appropriate, but not when our goal is to engage and communicate. This is not a performance evaluation. This is about communicating, connecting, and getting our needs met. So leading off with an observation is a good way to keep that channel open going into the next step. I mentioned earlier that it's about getting our needs met. We're going to spend some time, not so much today, but a little later on, maybe next week, talking about needs and how to identify and communicate our needs. But I think we could say in this situation, what mom needs, what she needs is when she gets home after a long day's work, she needs to know that she's not going to have to do someone else's work for them. That she can have a reasonably clean house when she gets home. She needs to know that the other people who are sharing this living space are going to take responsibility for cleaning up what they mess up. It sounds really simple, doesn't it? And it is in many ways, but we seem to have this way of needlessly complicating things. And we often do that by leading off with an evaluation, a judgment, an opinion, and so on. So, I want to run through a short exercise this morning that will give us a chance maybe to identify observations as distinguished from an evaluation or a mix of an observation and an evaluation. We want to keep them completely separate. We're looking for pure observations without an evaluation mixed in. And you can keep your answers to yourselves. I guess if we were doing a workshop here, we might break up into small groups where you could share your answers and discuss them, but you all didn't sign up for a workshop this morning, so we're gonna keep it simple, and you can keep your answer to yourself. And so let's just go ahead with the first one. Here it is. John was angry with me yesterday for no reason. Pretty simple, I think. What we have up there are actually two evaluations. No observations there, it's an evaluation. Now, we could observe John's behavior and conclude that he was angry, but we're not delivering the conclusion. We might deliver the observations. We might say, when you were talking to me yesterday, you were pounding your fist on the table, you raised your voice, your face turned red, and your eyes were bulging out, right? Those are all pure observations from which one might well conclude that he was angry, but we're not going there yet. So the observations are what we're focusing on, and of course, to say that he did something for no reason, how do we know? How do we know what's going on inside? So that also is an evaluation. All right, next one. Yesterday, Nancy bit her fingernails while watching television. It's an easy one. Pure observation. No evaluation there. If we would have said something like, yesterday evening, Nancy was nervous or anxious while watching television, that would be an evaluation. But here we just observe the behavior. All right, next one. Sam didn't ask for my opinion during the meeting. Another observation. Sam didn't ask for my opinion. That's a simple factual matter. He either did or he didn't. And what you're observing is that you didn't ask for my opinion. The evaluation might have been something like, you made me feel unimportant, or something like that. That's a whole different way of communicating. You didn't ask me for my opinion. Pure observation. Okay, here's a tricky one. My father is a good man. Could well be true, but it is an evaluation for what we're doing here with nonviolent communication. We could list the behavior, the actions that lead us to the conclusion that he's a good man. My father volunteered at the animal shelter. He gave 10% of his paycheck to charity. He attended every single one of my Little League games. You can identify all of that stuff. Those are the observations supporting the evaluation, which is what we're trying to lead with in this process. Okay, how about this one? Lucy told me I don't look good in yellow. Funny, that's what Karen tells me. I don't look good in yellow. Well, for Lucy, it's an evaluation. But for the person responding, it's a pure observation. He is simply reporting exactly what she said. She told me I don't look good in yellow. Boom. For Lucy, it was an evaluation, but he's reporting it as an observation. Okay, last one. My aunt complains when I talk with her. Well, that's an evaluation. The observation, again, would be the things that she did. She told me about all of her aches and pains and all the people who did things she didn't like last month or last year or that kind of thing. By the way, the first part of that, the aches and pains, is sometimes called an organ recital, if you've never heard of that before. But that would be a characterization rather than an observation. A little bit snarky too, but so I think that gives you a pretty good example of what we mean by observations and evaluations and how this works. And this is going to lead to another plug. Here we go. Once again, let's hear it from mindfulness, the meditation practice where we observe our thoughts, our feelings, all of the things that are going on around us. You know, people who say that they can't meditate because they notice that they're thinking all the time. Well, they have successfully identified the main point of the practice, all right? That's actually a little bit of a victory on the path. I can't meditate because I notice that I'm thinking all the time. Well, what do you know? You finally notice that you're thinking all the time. That's a big deal. That is a big deal. Our thoughts are rushing along like boats following each other down a flooded river, bow to stern with no space in between. Now, once we see that, that's when we can begin to develop a little separation between those thoughts. The more we observe, the more the process slows down, the more space appears, and that's where we can actually insert a pause between, insert a pause between the thoughts wherever and whenever we need to. And where we often need to do it the most is when we want to communicate with someone. We want to make sure that we are offering an observation rather than an evaluation. A few years ago, we studied the 21 skills of spiritual intelligence, and we learned a little thing that kind of helps us to do that, learning how to have that pause and be able to make that shift. And it's called, the process is called soul. And by that I don't mean this guy here, often called the godfather of soul. But by the way, here's something you probably didn't know about James Brown, but you really, really should. James Brown only really felt good 76% of the time. He felt nifty 13% of the time. 4% of the time he felt pleasant, and 7% of the time he felt like he had a head cold. So it isn't like he always felt good despite what he kept telling us. I feel good. No, SOUL is an acronym. All kidding aside, SOUL is an acronym which stands for Stop, Observe, Understand, and Find a Loving or a Compassionate Response. So, step one is stop. That's where mindfulness comes in. That's where we catch ourselves and insert the pause. We stop. The simplest and most difficult, because in the heat of the moment, it's difficult to actually stop and insert that pause. But if we practice, that's where we get into being able to short circuit the habitual response. If we can see the thoughts arising, if we can see the feelings arising before they get to our mouth, give ourselves just a moment to remember to pause. That's over half the battle right there. And if we pause, if we stop, then we can focus on simply observing instead of reacting and evaluating. Most of us are probably familiar with this guy here. Let's see if I got him up here. There he is. Dragnet, Joe Friday. Am I dating myself? Come on. Oh, remember Dragnet? And he would always be interviewing someone and he'd say, just the facts, ma'am, or just the facts, sir. That's all we need to do is to focus on the facts. Observation followed by understanding, which is where we can really discern that difference between what we're observing and what we're thinking about it, what our reaction is to it, and then keep them separate. That's the key, is to keep them separate. And finally, we can focus on that loving or compassionate response which is the way we maintain that connection. And once we have that compassionate response, then we're ready to move on to that next step in our communication process, which is identifying our feelings. We wouldn't care about a situation unless it caused some sort of physical reaction on our part, right? We wouldn't care about it, but can we name that reaction? Can we actually put words to the feeling, to the physical sensation that's causing us to care about this situation and need to engage the other person? This is where we run into a problem that's similar to separating observations from evaluations. What we want to separate here are our feelings separate from the thoughts that we have about our feeling or how we're interpreting the situation. Now, I never realized until I started studying nonviolent communication back in 2004, actually 2003, I never realized what a limited vocabulary I had for feelings. I think we're all familiar with the basic four, right? The basic four: happy, sad, angry, afraid. The real beauty of language and communication is that we can evaluate it to the level of an art form. We can elevate it to the level of an art form in just the way that an artist might use a palette of different color paints to create a portrait. We can expand our vocabulary to be like the paints on an artist's palette to create something that's nuanced and beautiful. And everyone can do it. You don't have to be a Dickens or a Faulkner. And at the same time, we don't want to show off. I think the word they use for that is pedantic. People like to use these big words that sound like they're walking around with a thesaurus in their back pocket and nobody knows what they're talking about. Or we also don't want to choose words that are so obscure and unusual that they cloud the meaning of what we're trying to get across. There's a happy medium there. In your bulletin, today's handout, on the second page, I've given you a feelings inventory, which comes from the Center for Nonviolent Communication. It's a list of feelings that might come up when our needs are not being met. Now, this is a list that's as long as your arm, and we don't need to memorize it or anything like that. There's another list, by the way, that's as long, that tells about a list of feelings when our needs are being met. But this is about our reaction when a need is not being met. So take it home and play with it, all right? This isn't something to memorize. It's there to be played with. You know, play around with it, read the words. I'm sure you're going to find some words that you really connect with, and others that would, under no circumstances, ever come from your mouth. That's kind of the way it is. For me, I can recall times when I was dazed and confused, but probably not perplexed. That's not a word that would come flowing from my mouth. And then I saw the word bewildered, and I thought, ooh, that's a nice word. That has a nice ring to it. So I could be dazed and confused, and maybe I'll start using bewildered a little bit more, but probably not perplexed. So play around with it, have some fun with it, and you might notice some of the words that are missing from this list, because often you're going to hear people saying things like, I feel unimportant. I feel ignored. I feel misunderstood. Or here's a big one we hear a lot. I feel disrespected. Guess what? Those aren't feelings. Those aren't feelings. Just because we lead off with the word feel doesn't make whatever follows a feeling. And that's probably the most difficult part. And I think this may be, well, there's a couple of difficult steps in this that take a little practice, but boy, once it clicks, it's like a major aha moment. But it's a difficult part in the difficult step in the process is distinguishing things that are and are not feelings. And that's where we're going to pick up again next week. It's going to be about discerning feelings from non-feelings, and then we have to be able to take responsibility for what we feel instead of blaming it on someone else. So we'll see you next time. Thank you.